Upland Software provides modern, secure fax solutions for businesses of all sizes. It drives content for intelligent processing and digital transformation worldwide, helping solve real business problems by providing enterprise software for getting things done. Upland offers cloud, hybrid, and on-premise fax solutions that integrate fax transmissions into business processes, utilizing machine learning technology to process and extract content. Didn't know that fax was still a thing? Have they got news for you? The demand for secure, user-friendly fax has skyrocketed for industries such as healthcare and financial services because users need trusted technology that safeguards sensitive information while supporting digital document workflows. Upland is ready to show you fax in action. Cloudcast listeners can try 1 month of Upland Cloud Fax for free and enter to win a wireless Bluetooth speaker by visiting info.uplandsoftware.com/cloudcast. That's info.uplandsoftware.com/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody's doing well, getting into the middle of April 2023. For those of the United States, hopefully you got your taxes done. It's that time of year. So, before I dive into another Sunday Perspectives, some good news, some bad news. I thought we were sort of out of the pollen season. You were going to have to put up with my sort of nasally, gravelly voice. We had a huge storm here in the southeast, and that usually washes away lots of pollen. And then yesterday, I come to find out, no, we're just into pollen phase 2. We now have tree pollen and grass pollen and all sorts of other wonderful pollens that ultimately make plants grow, which is a good thing. But boy, it really probably annoys the heck out of all of you. I appreciate you putting up with it. Numbers for the show have been up. They were at a little dip there for in the springtime, back up again. So I guess maybe this has become the norm. I hope it's not the norm. That's the bad news. You have to put up with it for a little bit today. Good news is going to Europe. KubeCon is next week. Actually, by the time you get this on Sunday, KubeCon will be just getting ready to get started. I am going to jump over to Europe for a couple of days early, going over to the UK, and then we'll be in Amsterdam for the full week. So excited about that. First time I've been to Europe since I looked at my passport, I think 2018. So 2018 or early 2019. So 4 or 5 years since getting to that part of the world, which is always wonderful, always beautiful, lots of good food, lots of nice people, lots of interesting things to see. So I'll be taking all that in. The next Sunday Perspective, I'm going to try and do a kind of a recap perspective on KubeCon. It's supposed to be 10,000 people, so that's very, very exciting, up from, I think, around 6,000 or 7,000 the last time I was in Europe, and so that's very, very exciting. Today I want to talk a little bit about an article I read, a Harvard Business Review article I read this week. It's actually a year old, but sometimes you miss things. The internet moves fast. And it really is talking about, the title of it is How Incumbents Thrive and Survive. And the whole premise of the article, and I thought it was interesting, especially as I was thinking about KubeCon and sort of the focus of KubeCon always being, hey, this is the disruptive place to be. This is, it's open source, it's open communities. This is the disruptive place to be. These companies are changing the world. And then, again, remembering that we're beginning to now see more and more companies, non-tech companies, non-software companies, non-cloud companies showing up at these events. And we've seen, at least in the States, we had Ford and Home Depot and a number of others. It'd be interesting to see who's there from a European perspective. But this article, How Incumbents Thrive and Survive, was a very interesting sort of data-driven look at the last roughly 30 years, 1995 to 2023. So yeah, what was that, 31 years, I guess. And really kind of the premise of the article. And, at first you read it and you go, I don't know about this, but the premise of the article is basically, this idea that, tech companies and tech will completely, wipe incumbent types of companies off the face of the earth, put them out of business, destroy their business, destroy their ecosystem, has actually proven not to be really true. And, it got me thinking, it was an interesting kind of, I don't want to call it a wake-up call, but somewhat of a, just a reminder that, while we get very, very excited about technology on this show, in our industry, at events like KubeCon and other events, the pace of change, especially as we get outside of the software world, as it impacts non-software, non-core technology businesses, moves fairly slow. And while there are, plenty of cautionary tales of, a Netflix overtaking Blockbuster, or Apple displacing a Nokia or a BlackBerry or something like that, or Kodak going out of business even though they had 95% market share in the camera world and the film world. Those tend to be sort of outliers. And so I thought it was a very interesting article. I put the link to it in the show note. It's freely available. I highly recommend folks take a look at it. But what I want to do is kind of dive into what they talk about as a framework for if you are an incumbent. And in their world, they talk about incumbents as being like Fortune 500 companies. But I think being an incumbent could mean really anything in this industry, especially if we talk about the software industry. An incumbent could be Red Hat or VMware or Cisco or anybody who was maybe dominant, say, a decade ago, and is still very relevant, but maybe faces certain pressures and is looking at another startup or a cloud provider or whoever as potentially being a threat to their business, maybe might by some considered an existential threat. But I want to look at both, what it means to the software industry that we live in, but also kind of the non-software industry, and really kind of look at their framework for, what are some things you can do when a new player comes in, a unicorn, the hot new thing comes along, and how do you respond to that? When should you respond to that? What's the appropriate way to respond to it? And what are some examples of, why, as we dig into the data, that incumbents tend to stick around much, much longer than most people tend to talk about when there's, headlines that everything's going to change. And I felt like this was a little bit relevant also, if I roll it back to last week's show, the new buzz that AI is going to displace everything. So we're going to dig into that after the break. Are you looking to stay ahead of the curve in the latest trends in enterprise tech? Look no further than the Breaking Analysis podcast with Dave Vellante. This data-driven program dives into the most important topics facing the enterprise tech industry today. With a data-first approach that leverages ETR's renowned surveys of IT decision-makers and insight from the CUBE community, Breaking Analysis delivers in-depth research on the most important topics facing technologists and IT buyers. Whether you're a business leader, an IT professional, investor, or just an avid follower of the industry, this podcast is a must-listen. Just search Breaking Analysis Podcast wherever you get your podcast and tune in today to stay ahead of the game in enterprise tech. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, I want to dig into a little bit of this article that was published in Harvard Business Review called "How Incumbents Thrive and Survive." It was, recognized as maybe their best article or their best research of 2022. It just popped up on my Twitter feed this week. Even though it's a year old, I think it's still very, very relevant. It's written by a gentleman named Julian Birkinshaw, who's a professor at the London School of Business. I believe the alma mater of Mick Jagger, if I'm not incorrect, but well recognized professor, well recognized university, research done by a number of people, published in, again, Harvard Business Journal, Harvard Business Review. And what was interesting to me was, he sort of started off by saying, look, let's take the common, talking points of technology, of most technologists, which is, basically new technologies going to come along. Incumbents in a space in which new technology and innovation exist really probably won't survive. This is endemic of every single industry. Every industry is potentially under threat from software. And, it's only a matter of time before the up and coming, the unicorn, the startup displaces that industry. What was interesting was, that's a mantra that we often talk about, the fast beat the slow, and old companies are dinosaurs. And, I think we tend to forget a lot of times, and, we're guilty of that on this show. I think we're guilty of that, as I mentioned, when we go to these tech conferences and we hear about, new innovation happening and how fast we're building change and how fast we're able to build new applications. And look how fast something scaled from 0 to 10 million users or 100 million users, right? All the talk these days of, what's going on in the AI space. And he does a real good job of just kind of going through some data. And basically, there's a couple of highlights that I thought were sort of interesting right at the beginning of the article. Basically, like I said, went back to 1995, looked at the Fortune 500, Fortune and Global 500, and was looking at how much things have changed over the years, maybe every 5 years, every 10 years, and really from then until now. And, this is something that I know I've used, and I think I borrowed it. I stole it maybe from Camellia Davis, who was at Pivotal at the time. But anyways, for any of us who are in the sort of building new software space, we like to talk about, look how much change has happened in the Fortune 500 over the last X numbers of years. And I think at the time we would sort of look at it and we would sort of look for headlines and highlights and stuff that would sort of make our case. And oftentimes we'd look at, okay, if we went back a decade, look at the biggest companies in the world were companies like Walmart and, ExxonMobil and, General Motors or whatever. And then we would look at the market share of some of the incumbents or the new companies who had sort of taken some of their things. So like in the case of Walmart, we looked at Amazon. In the case of, so let's say General Motors or Ford, we would look at Tesla. Maybe in the case of ExxonMobil, there wasn't necessarily a replacement there, but maybe you'd point to Google and you would say, oh no, data is the new oil, right? So we've had this thing in our tech industry for a while in which we've been looking for ways to explain that the tech industries, the tech giants, the new startup companies in this space are going to disrupt lots of companies. And one of the interesting things this article does, which I think is a good normalization, sort of rationalization, is they don't necessarily look at market capitalization or sort of valuation of companies, which again, what he does instead is he looks at, revenue and profit of these companies. So revenue of the companies, profitability of companies. And it's an interesting, again, sort of way of normalizing these things, because what it ends up doing is it does things like, let's say we look at Tesla's market share, right? If we look or market capitalization, if we look at Tesla's market capitalization, at various points in times over the last 5 to 10 years, and you compare that to the automotive industry, lots of people would say, well, look, Tesla is now valued at, as much as the next 5 to 10 companies in their space, companies like Ford and General Motors and Honda and Toyota and Mercedes-Benz and Fiat and, sort of the biggest of names. And what we get into, and we have this fascination to do in our industry, is to go, oh, well, Tesla has totally dominated that. Look at how much they're worth. And, I think what's interesting about the first thing he does in this article is I think he tries to find a way of normalizing that, because if, you subscribe to the idea that like tech is going to dominate everything, then at some point there needs to be a sort of second phase to that, which is, okay, let's take, for example, the Tesla example, where Tesla's market cap was as much as the next, 5 biggest or 10 biggest competitors. And then you sort of go, okay, well, let's see, are they really dominating them that much? So let's look at a few things. Let's look at how many cars have they sold, right? How much revenue have they driven? What's the profitability of them getting there? And you start to realize that some of these things, the domination piece doesn't necessarily hold up to scrutiny, because, in contrast, if we look at something like let's say Apple, right? And again, for those of you who've been around for a long time, and I hate to keep doing this in Sunday perspective, you've known Apple to be a big deal back in the original Mac days. They completely went under when IBM came along and Microsoft came along and Intel computers came along and sort of almost wiped them off. Kind of almost put them out of business, to the point where Steve Jobs quit or was fired by Apple. At some point he came back, had to take a big loan from Microsoft. But, Apple went from being a big deal, but not overtaking the computing industry. Like, they weren't bigger than IBM. They weren't bigger than Hewlett Packard. They were just new and interesting and growing fast, to almost, going out of business, to then, coming back and going, okay, we're going to try and reinvent some things. And we'll talk a little bit about, what approach they took. But, they came along, first went into, miniaturization of computing, again, got back into laptops, but got into iPods, basically miniaturized and digitized music. And then obviously the iPhone came along and the rest is history. But in the case of the iPhone with Apple, as opposed to Tesla and cars, they literally remade the entire industry of sort of mobile communication from, what BlackBerry and Nokia had done. Tesla really hasn't done that. Tesla has been a driver and an initiator of, moving to electrify and sort of change the experience of what the inside of an automobile is like. But unlike Apple, who has figured out supply chain, has figured out the ecosystem around it, has figured out mass monetization, has spurred on other industry people like Google and Samsung and others, the entire Android industry, to completely remake that. Tesla hasn't done that, right? Tesla still sells less cars in a week than the rest of the industry does in a day, or they do in a year. The rest of the industry does in a day or a week. They still haven't, don't have large market share. They don't have huge market share, the number of cars and so forth. And so the real reason I point these two things out is I think the framework of this article is a very good way of looking at what happens when we talk about something new, some technology taking over an industry. So I want to dive into a couple of things. So they talk about, if they go back to 1995 and then compare it to today, about 40% of the companies that were there in the Fortune 500 have stayed, are still there, sort of the biggest of the incumbents, right? About 50% of them have gone through some sort of merger or been sold. So, maybe they're still somewhat present as part of what's there, but, they're no longer, distinctly mentioned by themselves. So for example, like Exxon and Mobil were two pieces of the Fortune 500. Those have merged, right? We've seen in the banking industry, JP Morgan Chase, right? JP Morgan used to be its own company. Chase Bank used to be its own company. Those types of things have merged. We've seen things like Ford. We've seen things ebb and flow. We've seen things like Mercedes-Benz eventually merged with Chrysler and then eventually merged, became bought by Fiat. We've seen those types of things happen. So about half have stayed. About half of what was there in 1995 has gone through some sort of transformation, but is still somewhat around, right? Only about 7 or 8% of them have actually dropped out, or no longer part of it. Now, that might mean they're 501. It might mean they're no longer in the business anymore. It could be a lot of things. It could be a big retailer like a JCPenney's or something like that. And about half of the companies that are now in the Fortune 500 were there, but maybe not in the Fortune 500 around that 1995 time. So what it sort of says is, like, as much as we talk about a Google or a Netflix or an Amazon or anybody who's really sort of emerged over this period of time, there aren't that many of them. And what we see more so is sort of an evolution of a lot of companies that are in that space, right? The ability to get to become that large and to sort of dominate in that space gives you a lot more than just technology superiority, right? Now, the other thing it highlights is, like I mentioned, sort of the Blockbusters, the Nokias, the Kodaks that really don't exist at all anymore, or at least for the most part don't exist, are really sort of anomalies. And while we can use them to make examples of like, hey, this is what happens when you totally miss a technology shift coming along and you actively fight against it, they are sort of few and far between. And most companies use their incumbent status, use their status of market awareness and brand trust and supply chains and partner ecosystems to use one of what he highlights as 4 approaches to both surviving, but then he also highlights that most of these companies, even while an incumbent a new company's been chasing them, a unicorn's been chasing them, the incumbents have been growing as well. So, what that sort of signifies is that these unicorn companies don't just invent markets out of nowhere, create them, grow them, and then the people they compete against are essentially falling away. You see, typically what you see is you do still see growth in that space, and I think it makes a lot of sense if we think about it in our context in cloud computing. As much as like Amazon, for example, sort of invented the cloud computing market as we think about it, even though there are people doing SaaS before Amazon and other things like that. But sort of the cloud computing market in the sense of IT, they've grown, they've had wild success, up to 80 billion. They'll probably end up being at 90 or 100 billion after this year. But we've still seen the growth of the rest of the industry, right? We've seen VMware grow. We've seen Red Hat grow. We've seen Cisco grow. We've seen Oracle grow. We've seen Microsoft, reinvent themselves and grow. So these aren't also kind of winner take all markets. And again, I think it's always good to sort of have some perspective on that. I think we have a tendency to sort of go, this one company is just going to dominate. They're going to change everything. And then as you kind of got into it, and I think the article is a very good thing for folks to read, whether you are at one of these startups, you're trying to change the world, you're trying to change a market, you've got your eyes on a big company that you're trying to go, take their market share, you want to change what they do, or you're at an incumbent, he lays out a very, very good sort of 4-step plan as to how you can get there. The first one is, so there's 4 pieces to sort of paths that you can take if you are an incumbent, right? And again, knowing what an incumbent can do if you are a startup is also as useful. It's sort of the Sun Tzu playbook, right? Like know what your competition is going to do, and then how are you going to respond to that, react to that, drive change in it. The first one is what he calls fight back, right? And this essentially means, okay, a new entrant comes into your marketplace. They have potentially had some success. The first thing you can do, especially if they are, digital, where you're more analog, is, create a digital competitor to what they do, right? So if you are, use an example, Tesla comes along, they build an all electric car. You are General Motors, you try and build a electric car, even though, building electric engines is not really your specialty. But building automobiles, having supply chain, having parts suppliers, having global reach, having dealers and distributors, that is what you can do. And we've seen this in some cases. And in some cases, these work well. Other cases, it takes multiple times before the incumbent can get to a point where they're competitive. But they also have the advantage of brand awareness, deep pockets, the ability to hire talent, all those sorts of things. So first option is sort of fight back. And we've seen this in a number of instances. We've seen some successes with it. We've seen some failures with it. But this tends to be sort of the first way that people tend to address it, because again, taking it from a position of strength as opposed to a position of weakness is, oftentimes the most recommended strategy. The second piece is to sort of double down. And double down meaning you look at some of your competitors, you look at what they're doing, and you start to consolidate that, right? So instead of fighting your competitors, maybe you are doubling down in terms of buying up your competitors, right? And we've seen a number of tech companies do this. They can't necessarily compete against them, but what they do would fit nicely in their portfolio if they owned it. Cisco is famous for this. Oracle's been famous for this. VMware, Microsoft, all of the really big companies in our industry have been very famous for kind of going like, I can't always beat the startup, but I'm also 10, 100, 1,000 times bigger than them. I can acquire them and bring them into the fold because we have the same we have the same buyers, we have the same buying patterns and so forth. So this model works relatively well. Obviously, it's an expensive way of doing it because you're paying a premium to acquire that company, acquire that technology. But that premium oftentimes, kind of covers up for you having to make investments in it, you making the mistakes that you often make in the fight back approach to it, and it buys you sort of known, kind of people have already proven that this thing works, right? The third approach is what's called retrench, and this is where you often see people go, okay, the game has changed so much. I no longer can fight in that game. I no longer can compete in that game. But I do have a number of assets. I do have a number of core values, a number of things that we do that we can shift them to other things. And there's some good examples in the article about like Fujifilm moving from, having competed against Kodak and being sort of in that space and then realizing that they didn't want to get Kodak as they saw things like digital, the camera and the phone and all those sort of things happening. And how they really move to other types of image processing, other types of digital, photography and other types of things. So you do see this in some cases where companies will kind of shift out of that original market they were in, where the new unicorn is, but they take the values they have and shift them into other things. And, there's a number of things that I know we'll talk about this in some future shows. But, again, a viable approach, oftentimes has some early, pain, in terms of maybe people get laid off or you have to, retool some people to do some things. People like Intel are going through this right now, right? Intel's a perfect example. Obviously they have expertise in building chips and x86 chips and building fabs, but they're realizing that in order to really capture the larger part of the market for computing chips and so forth, they may need to be in the fabless type of world, right? You're seeing them work with, some of the other people that they used to be their competitors in the past. And so Intel is sort of a great example of, trying to retrench. Intel's kind of going through multiple strategies at the point. They're trying to do kind of all of them, but they do have an aspect of it that's retrench that people can go, dig into and look into. We've covered a little bit on past shows. Ben Thompson does a really good job of covering this. And the last one is sort of the move away strategy, right? Like this, nobody really wants to get to this point, but, move out of that space, go into something completely different. And there are not a lot of examples of this, but, there are, a few examples of companies who have said, look, my brand is very, very valuable. I'm going to get out of this space entirely, and I'm going to move on to something else. So I think what's interesting is, we have a tendency to always focus on sort of number one and number two, fight back and double down, right? Either, build the thing yourself or acquire the thing and then not have to worry about it. I think the other thing that was really interesting about this article that folks have to sort of remember and just keep in the back of their mind is that two things. Number one, there is always going to be much more than technology in what shapes the competitive nature of any market segment of any industry, right? So as much as having the most data, for example, in this AI game. So maybe you look at somebody like OpenAI and you go, oh, they have the most data, right? Maybe they should win, right? A lot of other things have as much of an impact on that, right? Having the best technology oftentimes will help you with those early adopters, those pre-crossing the chasm types of customers. But as you get into companies and customers who are a little less excited about risk, a little more risk averse. Maybe technology isn't that going to be that big of a differentiator in what they do. They have a tendency to also buy on brand relationships, on trusting the company, having worked with them for many, many years. Maybe physicality as opposed to just digital plays a role. Location of certain things. Because again, we do live in this world in which it is digital, but it's also, we live in a physical world. We're not entirely in the metaverse. And then, things like partner networks and the ecosystem around it, because not everybody does business directly with the incumbent. Oftentimes they do it with a partner that's somewhere in between. That could be, somebody who helps you with financial planning. It could be somebody who helps you with, how you buy certain things, whatever it might be. So that piece is really, really important, and incumbents will often rely on that especially early on in the game as the game is changing as much as anything. And if you think about this in the context of what we do, Microsoft is probably the best example of this, right? Like Microsoft was behind Amazon Web Services early on for people would argue maybe 4, 5, 6, 7 years, but they were able to rely on a relationship that they had built up with customers for decades prior to that. And now they've made acquisitions. They've applied the fight back approach. They've applied the double down approach. In some cases, they've applied the retrench approach. And they're now where they are now, where they've made some very good acquisitions. They've built out their capabilities. They've continued to hire good people. And now they're a viable, maybe not always, head-to-head competitor, but viable competitor in many, many places to Amazon and now with some of the OpenAI stuff to what's going on with Google and search and so forth. So I think that's one thing to be very conscious about. And the second thing is, you have to remember that just because the unicorn comes along with technology, so much of the technology that's out there these days it's widely available, right? So very little stuff is entirely proprietary that nobody else has. Now, there are some advantages you could get in terms of how much data you collect and so forth, but kind of, all technology is available to all people. And you have to realize that, the incumbents are investing in transformational technologies as well. Now, they may not always be as visible as some things, right? Like they might not be building at the time the best customer-facing user interface, user experience, mobile app, whatever that could be. But they're, oftentimes investing in things for, data analysis. Maybe they're better understanding their market. They're being more efficient with what they do. Sometimes it's cost cutting and it's cost justification and cost avoidance types of investments in technology, right? Well, it builds up their bank. It builds up their kind of their war chest, their dry powder, if you will, that allows them to then make bigger investments. Could be an acquisition, could be a fight back strategy down the road, right? So, the article dives into it. You can't just sort of assume that because some incumbent got $100 million from a VC that, oh, okay, well, they're going to go dominate that market. The people they're competing against oftentimes have 10x, 100x that much money they're sitting on. They've just got to be able to overcome their own internal inertia, their own maybe unawareness of the technology in terms of people they have. But they have the advantage of all those other things that are there. So anyways, this wasn't intended to be a, hey, the incumbent will always win. We see plenty of examples of disruption happening. But I think it's a very good article and kind of a good reminder, especially as we go into certain trade show seasons, about the pace at which change happens, the way that both the unicorn tries to go into the market, tries to tell the world that the world's going to be different, follow me into this path forward, and the ways that incumbents in all sorts of industries, not just tech, respond back to, changes in the market and, and how the game is played, if you will. So anyways, good article, 8, 9, 10 minutes, maybe a good Sunday morning read, if you will. It's, skip the newspaper, read this, something like that, something to read during the week. Anyways, thought it would be kind of a good Sunday perspective to dig through, especially, like I said, going into a week in which we're going to talk all about disruption and other things like that at KubeCon. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for listening. As always, thanks for telling a friend. We've got a lot coming up on the show. The last couple of weeks, we've seen a big uptick again in listens. So thank you again. Sometimes it's topics, sometimes it's just seasonal. So thank you all for listening. Excited to see a lot of people in person at KubeCon. Like I mentioned, I haven't been to Europe in a few weeks or a few years, and excited to see a lot of faces. So with that, I'll wrap it up and I'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.